The stars that are embroidered into the tapestry of the night sky have guided Māori people since the beginning of time. These stars enabled Māori to traverse the greatest expanse of ocean on the planet to arrive here in Aotearoa. It also guided their day-to-day activities by combining the rising and setting of stars with the lunar phases and the position of the sun. Māori were able to sync their lifestyles to the natural rhythms of the environment and understand that this environment would dictate to them when they could plant and harvest, when they could hunt and fish, when they could interact, and when they needed to spend time in isolation, planning and preparing for another season. This knowledge existed within every tribal group and drove our activities every day, every month, every season, and from year to year, from winter to summer and back again to winter. So this program is about us exploring the depth of knowledge that pertains to Māori astronomy, and in particular Matariki. It is a journey that goes beyond what we know, it goes beyond what we have experienced, and it goes beyond Matariki. Last episode, we went through some of the major activities that were undertaken by Māori during the most active and hottest period of the year, the raumati o summer. Now we move into autumn, and we have a look at the 3 months that make up this period and the activities that are associated with each of these months, as Māori worked very hard to prepare themselves for the oncoming winter and another rising of Matariki. Ngahuru marks the period when the sun begins to leave his summer maiden, Hine and return north. The sun is no longer directly high in the sky above our heads during the middle of the day, but is starting to arc across the sky as the sun moves out towards the ocean, getting further and further away from the earth. So the season of Ngahuru gets its name from Ngahuru, which means 10. So the first month is Ngahuru o Poutūterangi. Poutūterangi is a star that rises in the morning sky before the sun in the 10th month of the Māori year. And so the word 10 or Ngahuru is not only applied to that first month of the autumn period, which is Poutūterangi, or the 10th month, but it's also applied to the whole period. Another name for autumn is Mātahi o Rongo. So this is the period where Rongo begins to withdraw back into the earth, and it is a time of harvest. And these are the major occurrences that happens during this time. There are 3 months in the Ngahuru phase. Poutūterangi, which is in the 10th month. The 11th month is Paengawhāwhā, and the 12th month is Haratua. So we move into this 3-month period where the harvest is completed and everything begins to slow down as we retreat back into this period of isolation, contemplation, and preparing ourselves for the new rising of Matariki. The major event during this period is the harvest. The harvest occurs in Ngahuru. Now, exactly when Māori would lift the crops, such as the kumara, depended on a number of signs and a number of environmental indicators. For instance, the lunar phases, Also, they would examine the gardens closely and pull up a couple of plants just to see exactly how ready the kumara crops were. If they weren't ready, or they felt that there were an additional few more weeks, or perhaps even an extra month in this year's summer, they would leave the crops in the ground for them to mature. But if there was a single activity that this month is known for, it is the harvesting, particularly of the kumara, which would sustain people throughout the winter. Other major events that occurred around this time was the tunaheke, or the spawning of eels as they would migrate to the ocean to spawn. These eel migration phenomena occurred right throughout the country, and eels in their tens of thousands would leave swamps and rivers and lakes and head to the ocean. And Māori knew when they would run. Māori would wait for this occurrence. They knew in certain lunar phases of the period that is known as Ngahuru, around the 10th month, especially if there was a rain, they knew that the eels were ready to spawn. They were ready to head to the ocean, and they would trap them, they would collect them, they would gather them and spend a month, maybe longer so, preparing, drying out these eels, and they would eat them throughout the year. So these preserved eels would be a massive staple diet, an important form of protein for our ancestors through this period. One of the major signs during Ngahuru is the returning of some of the birds back to other parts of the world. In particular, we have already spoken about the kumara birds, the pipiwharaurua and the kwekweā, the shining cuckoo and the long-tailed cuckoo, and their arrival in Mahuru was a sign that we should plant the kumara. Their departure in Ngahuru, or in Poutūterangi in the 10th month, was a sign that it was now time to lift the crops. So these two birds in particular have a direct correlation and association with the gardens and the crops that were grown in the gardens, with their arrival and with their departure. There were also other astronomical signs that allowed our ancestors to understand that the crops were ready to harvest. One of these signs is whānui. Whānui is the star Vega. And that star is seen towards the north, rising in the morning in about Ngahuru, or around the 10th month. When that star is seen in the sky, along with the star called Panitinaku, which means tinaku germinate, and the star Poutūterangi. Together, these three stars make up a constellation known as Te Kumara a Mataora, or the Kumara from Mataora. This massive constellation, when it was fully visible in the morning sky, was the sign that the kumara will be mature and it is time to harvest. This is also taken into account with the lunar phase, the returning of the various birds such as the kwekweā and the pipiwharaurua, as well an examination of the crops themselves to determine when it was time to harvest the gardens. Another important sign in the late autumn, in the month of Haratua, is the setting of Matariki. Matariki is visible in the night sky for around 11 months. But it's not only its rising that our ancestors celebrated. It's setting in the western sky with the sun. In the month of Haratua, or the last month of the Māori year, was when our ancestors acknowledged the journey of the dead of the year who had now completed their cycle and were being taken to the underworld to be prepared. And upon the rising of Matariki a month later, the spirits of those who had passed throughout the year were taken from the massive canoe, that constellation in the sky, and their spirits were thrown into the cosmos to become stars against the chest of the sky for eternity. And this is the origins of the phrase, "Kua whetūrangi hia koe," you have now become a star. In a modern sense, the way that the environment is warming is having a significant change in how we understand our seasons. This year is a prime example of how long a summer can be, as we are now into the last month of the Māori year. By all accounts, should be a cold period of time. Is actually quite warm, and there are still gardens that haven't been harvested yet due to the fact that the summer has been so long. And this is something that in the long history of the country is a variation, but in recent times is becoming the norm. As our seasons and our year becomes a lot warmer, our summers and our winters are becoming much later, and our winter period is shorter, our summer period is much longer. And it's something that is difficult in terms of aligning our seasons and ourselves to the changing seasons when the seasons are not changing as drastically and as quickly as they used to. So the seasons are becoming warmer, and it is a direct result of global warming. Our seasons and our observations of the seasons are changing. The summers are getting longer, start earlier, and last longer, and the winters are much shorter. And this has a significant impact on the environment. We have trees and plants flowering and fruiting out of season. Animals not too sure what kinds of plants they should be eating, along with the increased pollution levels and the environmental degradation that happens because of humanity, that the seasons and our ability to sync in with the seasons is becoming more and more difficult as there is more change in our environment. The stars are still appearing with their various signs, with their various seasonal markers, and for the most part, they are still in sync with the environment. But there are growing elements within the environment in places like fresh water, where the eels are no longer migrating or going out to spawn in the same numbers, particularly when they have to navigate things like dams. The mature eels can't get to the ocean, and the new glass eels can't get back into fresh water. So it is upsetting this natural rhythm. The summers are much longer, and we have plants now that only traditionally fruited once a year that may fruit twice. We have animals that are in good condition when they should be lean, and in seasons when they should be really, really healthy, they're actually quite unhealthy looking. The environment is synced to astronomy. And so there are many signs that appear in the night sky, including the lunar phases, the position of the sun and the stars, that directly relate to what's happening on Earth, not just in terms of plant life and gardens and fishing, but even humans. The lunar calendar and the environmental indicators impact upon our lives. And our ancestors knew this, and this knowledge was embedded into our day-to-day activities. Not just when to hunt and when to plant and when to fish, but how we were feeling, when to undertake activities, when to relax, when it was going to be difficult to work, when to plan. All of these things were in sync. But we've moved away from this system. The environment still wants to sync with these astronomical markers, But what doesn't want to sync with those astronomical markers and the rest of the environment is humanity. In fact, we push back against that because we have this idea that we are the most important thing in the environment, that it's our job to conquer the wild, untamed land, conquer the mountains and fish out all the fish out of the sea. What's happening with our pollution of the air and of the ocean is everything's warming up. And as there's a warming, our seasons are getting out of sync with some of those astronomical markers. And that's been driven by humanity. This year, Matariki rose. And of the 22 years I've watched Matariki rise, this has been the first time that I have seen Matariki spread as far as it is. And there was a number of us that noticed it. It was something that we all saw how far apart the individual stars in Matariki were standing. That is a direct sign that it's going to be an extremely long summer. And at that time, I made the prediction that for me, it was a sign that we are going to have a longer summer than we've ever had before. There were signs of summer around Ngahuru, and not long after in Whiringa. So we were in October, November, and it was starting to get quite warm. In the last month of the Māori year, Haratua, which is May-ish. And we are still getting temperatures into the late teens and into the early 20s, which means this is still a very warm period of time. There are still flowers on the manuka trees. There are still activities like bees are still around. Wasps are still around. There's quite a lot of activity still happening because of the heat. And it is this warming of the globe that is actually putting our environment out of sync with some of these astronomical markers today. Ko te hautapu tētahi o ngā tikanga I whakamahia e o tātou mātua tīpuna ki te whakanui I a Matariki me ngā hua ka puta ki a tātou te tangata I te tau. Nō reira, ka kohi I ētahi kai, nō roto mai I ētahi wāhanga o te taiao. He tuna mai te awa, hei whakanui I a waiti, he ika moana, hei whakanui I a waitā, he kūmara hei whakanui I a tipuānuku, me tētahi manu hei whakanui I a tipuārangi. Ka mahia he hapi, hei tunu I ēnei momo kai. Nō reira, I te rewatanga mai o Matariki, I huakina, tēnei umu, ka rere ko te auahi, ki runga, hei kai mā Matariki, ki ora noa ia Matariki, kia mahi anoa Matariki I tana mahi pīkau I ngā mate o te tau. He hoki, whakahoki mai I ngā tohu me te mauri o ngā kai ki a tātou te tangata, koe nei, tēnei tikanga, tēnei mahi, te whāngai te hautapu. There are generally 12 months in the Māori year. It begins in midwinter. The first month, pipiri. Second, hōngongoi. The third month, here turi kōka. Then we move into spring. We have mahuru, whiringa and whiringarangi. Then we have the summer months, hakihea, kohitātea, huitanguru. Then we have the autumn months, Poutūterangi, Paengawhāwhā, and the last month is Haratua. These months are lunar months, so they follow the lunar cycle. And in a lunar calendar year, there are 354 days. This is different to the 365 and a quarter day solar Gregorian Western calendar that we follow today. So there are 11 days difference between a solar year that follows the sun and the lunar year that follows the moon. So this means after 1 year, there are 11 days difference. In 2 years, there are 22 days difference. And in 3 years, there is 33 days or a whole month difference between a solar year and a lunar year. And this means our months get later and later and later. So to reconcile this 33-day difference after 3 years, Māori inserted an additional month into the calendar every 3 years to reset the calendar system. And this happened around Matariki. And this 3-year cycle is known to Māori as Te Tautoru Nui o Matariki, or the 3-year cycle of Matariki. So next month is Pipiri. And when Pipiri rises and we get to the correct lunar phase where we are meant to celebrate Matariki in the sky, it's not going to be visible because of the 33-day slippage after 3 years. And we insert an additional month. That month is called Ruhanui, or the lazy month, the month that follows behind. And we follow Ruhanui until it gets to the Tangaro lunar phase, where we celebrate Matariki, and then we go into our second month, and this reconciles our calendar system and resets the year into this 3-year system that uses Matariki as the marker of time. The sky that we see from the top of the North Island to the bottom of the South Island is the same sky. We see the same stars, we see the same movements, the same lunar phases, no matter where we are. What is different is its application depending upon the region you're in and depending upon your environment. Now, sometimes there are slight differences between the environments of certain locations, while at other times there are extreme differences between the environments. The tides on the west coast are different to the tides on the east coast. The environment in the subtropical north is very, very different to the bottom of the South Island. There are key cultural species and indicators in some regions that don't occur in other regions. Coastal tribes have a completely different food source and relationship with the ocean as opposed to tribes living inland in mountainous areas. And all of these factors feed into the way that we understand our calendar system and our division of time. They all inform our seasons, our months, our activities, our days, and the entire year. My hope is that we begin to reconnect to our environment. We begin to sink our lives back in to the natural ebbing and flowing of the world. And we understand that we are not in charge of the world and the planet and all its resources, but are actually part of it. I hope that we begin to live our lives with a much broader sense of everything that encompasses who and what we are. Not just natural resources as part of the economy, but the earth, the stars, the moon, the sun, the trees, the animals, as an extension of who we are. I hope that we are able to embed some of the lessons of our ancestors into our everyday lives, that we can begin to practice some of these lessons, some of these cultural activities and spiritual activities in a way that enriches our lives, in a way that is more sustainable and reconnects us to our past in order to help us survive in the future.
Te papai e tapo one ki te raki e tū